So last time we were talking about um, the John Benet Ramsey case as it pertains to this beaver fur that was found on the uh, adhesive side of the tape that was taped to John Benet's mouth. Other things found on the tape were red fibers consistent with the garment that Patsy wore the night of Christmas and the night when John Benet was murdered. Um, and we were analyzing beaver fur. Beaver fur. Who would wear beaver fur to a crime scene? Like who would do that? And we saw that in 2026. Saw that in 2026. Beaver fur can typically go from somewhere around for like a beaver coat, somewhere between $2,000 and $5,000. That's what we show. And then, if we, and that's a natural long haired beaver fur coat. But if we look at something like a sheared or a dyed beaver coat, that can be somewhere between 4,000 to 7,000, maybe even higher. We look at hats, some hats go between $700, $800, and some just, maybe some other custom hats, custom dress hats or what have you, or some trapper style hats, beaver hats can go for about $300 to $500. And we looked at what those numbers might be in 1996, and we're looking at somewhere, prices around $960 to $2,400. In some cases for the sheared and dyed beaver coat, we're looking at $1,900 to $3,300. For the hats, we're looking at $336, $384 for the trapper style hat. We're looking at prices about 144 to 240. If we backtrack the CPI, take today's dollars and we divide maybe by a conversion rate of 2.08, right? And say for example you take 700 and divide it by 2.08, and that's going to give you the number about $336.53. But they round it for you. Should be 337 if they round it correctly, but no biggie. But they say they take a conversion rate of 2.0 now and converting it back to 1996. So you take the $2,000, you convert it, you divide it by $2,000 divided by 2.08, and that's your number. So we're kind of talking about how expensive it was to bring beaver fur on the crime scene. If we're talking about a coat in today's numbers, that might cost you on the low end $2,000. Or we're talking about a hat that might cost you on the low end $700. It tells us a little bit about the type of person that is in John John and Patsy's house late at nighttime trying to kidnap John Benet. And when we come to that realization, we might wonder, why did the cops ever decide to look at homeless people? Maybe they became homeless after they had $4,000 to spend on a coat or $700 to spend on a hat. Maybe they just fell on hard times and they said, no matter what, no matter what happens, one thing I always have is my beaver coat and my beaver hat. And so this person decides to commit a crime wearing a beaver coat or a beaver hat that It's costing them $700, $2,200, things of that nature. This person has money or got money from somewhere or found this coat in the trash or something like that. Yeah, that's because that's what happens. They found a beaver coat in the trash, or maybe they found the beaver coat at a garage sale. Maybe they found a beaver coat at a fire sale. Maybe they found it at Salvation Army or Goodwill and got it on a discount. Got it for cheap. I can believe that. I can respect that. So they come in with this expensive coat and they get busy. They get to work. But if we consider that it's probably unlikely that, somebody who is experiencing homelessness would probably be wearing something like this. And no, and not to mention, no person that the BPD interviewed did they mention was wearing a beaver fur coat. And so they cleared all of the people experiencing homelessness. They cleared them from this case. I want to continue then into interpreting sort of the beaver hair and the animal hair evidence and talk about possible scenarios. Let's just walk through them. We'll talk about them, see what makes sense as we continue to traverse through this. So the first one, and we have three scenarios. The intruder wearing the beaver fur clothing or accessories, given that the beaver hair was embedded in the duct tape and dark animal hairs were found on John Bonet's hand, yet no beaver fur items were present in the Ramsey household. The most straightforward explanation is that the tape or the perpetrator's clothing had been in contact with beaver fur before the crime. A person wearing a beaver fur coat or hat, mittens, or trimming could have, transferred hairs to the duct tape when tearing a piece or when applying it to John Bonet. Similarly, if John Bonet had grabbed at the attacker's clothing during a struggle, she could have picked up dark animal hairs on her hands. Second scenario, pre-used tape with external contamination. The black duct tape, which is to say that the black duct tape may have been, what page is okay, yeah. The black duct tape may have been used previously for a craft or a household project involving beaver fur, for example, taping a fur garment or a toy, transferring hairs to the tape before it was brought to the Ramsey home. Patsy Ramsey was an avid crafter, and investigators questioned her about fur clothing and household items, but she did not report owning beaver fur. I mean, if I know you found beaver fur on the scene and it might possibly be linked to me, why would I say, oh, absolutely, I did own beaver fur? Why would I say that? Why would I put myself in that line of fire like that? And then the third thing, third party transfer through packaging. Beaver fur hairs could have adhered to the tape during manufacturing or packaging if the tape roll came into contact with fur garments in a store or warehouse. However, the beaver fur or the beaver hair was singular, and there were also dark animal hairs on John Bonet's hands, suggesting active contact rather than accidental contamination. And that's kind of what I wanted to get to. Assessing the likelihood of an internal versus external source. So when we look at the evidence and whether or not it points to an external source, you have the black duct tape, the garrote cord, and the end of the paintbrush used to tighten the cord. And I think everything except the cord were said to have been sourced outside. Uh, but I think the end of the paintbrush was actually argued to be from Patsy. The beaver hair and the dark animal hairs found on the tape and John Bonet's hands did not match any items in the home. So this is, as Judge Carnes said, was a strong implication that the duct tape and some binding materials came from outside the home. So one of the stories that John often tells is that this person, and John Andrew, that this person bought some things from outside the home and pretty much knew that he could get away finding some things inside the home, and so he did that. And who decides to bring half of the stuff that they need into a home for a kidnapping and just assumes that you're going to have the other half of it? Like who does that? Like who does that? And so that's what John is suggesting. Um, the materials are coming from the outside. And additional indicators of an intruder include unidentified shoe prints in the basement, the high tech boot that John and Patsy won't claim, that Burke mentioned that he had high tech boots, and he even described them down to the compass. Got to go look for some of those and see what we're talking about. But a palm print on the wine cellar door and male DNA under John Bonet's fingernails and in her undergarments that did not match any family member. Evidence suggesting internal involvement. Then, fibers consistent with Patsy's red and black sweater jacket were found on the duct tape, in a paint tray, and in the ligature. Fibers consistent with John's black wool Israeli shirt were found inside of John Bonet's undergarments. While these matches are described as chemically and microscopically consistent rather than definite, they indicate that the parents' clothing or similar garments were in contact with key crime scene items. Hold it right here so I can remember my place. When we think about, and we talked about this last video, when we think about how Patsy, and I'm telling you right now, it starts getting weird, and the Ramsey camp has no explanation for it. When we think about Patsy, like we talked about last video, Patsy, there are several times in this case where external meets internal. What do I mean by that? Some of you already know where I'm going because we talked about it before. External beaver hair on the adhesive side of the duct tape meets red wool, synthetic wool, microscopically similar to Patsy on the adhesive side of the duct tape. If the beaver hair garment is sourced outside and Patsy's sweater was upstairs, how does Patsy's fibers get on the underside of the tape? Someone said, oh, it could have been real quick when John takes the tape that already apparently in their estimation or in their theory already had the beaver hair under it. But they dropped it on the cover that John Bonet was wrapped in, which apparently was littered with Patsy's red wool fiber. But journalists pushed back and said, yeah, that would explain that. But it doesn't explain why her wool fibers would also end up in her, in her paint tray when she never used that jacket to paint, let alone in the material, in the rope that was used on her daughter. when we talk about getting close, we're talking about getting close. You can't get no closer than the ligature that was used in the crime. How did fibers get in that? How do we have fibers littered on that? And part of that rope ends up upstairs. So we have a convergence under the tape where we see something internal and we see something external. Internal being the microscopically similar fibers coming from Patsy, and external being the beaver fur that was never sourced to the Ramsey home. But another place in which we see these two worlds collide quite interestingly and quite disturbingly is the presence of the microscopically similar black Israeli wool on the inside of John Benet's long johns, sitting alongside the unidentified male's DNA that they say exists on the crotch. How do those two worlds collide? Even with the existence of somebody trying to wipe down John Benet. If the shirt, talk to me, I'm confused. If the shirt was nowhere in, because we can say, Patsy, yeah, on the outside, yeah, those fibers end up on the outside. They just happen to travel and trickle up to the tape. Yeah, we can say that about Patsy's garments. I'll let you get away with it. But how can we explain the unidentified male's DNA existing alongside a microscopically similar wool garment that is similar to what John wore the night of the crime? How do those two worlds come together? How do they collide? How do they coexist? They should not be there. If I go down, and that's what we started asking about the DNA, if I go down and I look at the long johns, and we are so quick, because I think people forget this, we're so quick to point out on the upper right side of the long johns how we find unidentified male DNA on the upper right corner of the waistband of the long johns. But we fail to mention the possible inclusion of Patsy and Burke's DNA on those same pants, or Patsy or Burke's touch DNA on those same pants. Patsy, I will give you for the pants. But you confuse me when we talk about the Barbie nightgown, in which Patsy couldn't find. That's why I'm confused. Because how then do the two worlds collide where Patsy's red fibers, because they were on the cover, don't transfer to the pants, but her touch DNA transfers to the pants? Or enough to where it can say, Patsy might be on this. But it gets disturbing when it looks like it's possible that Burke may have transferred. That's when it gets disturbing for the Barbie nightgown, I believe. How do these worlds collide? You are skating on thin ice when you say Patsy. But when we start saying John, we have a problem. We track down very methodically, why is somebody on the crime scene in a beaver, an expensive beaver garment? That's what confuses me. Gender considerations, and I'll close with this. Gender considerations for the beaver fur. Well, oh, I'm not even done with that. Possible innocent explanations include secondary transfer when John dropped the tape onto a blanket containing fibers from Patsy's clothing, or when Patsy hugged John Bonet's body after she was found. However, fiber locations in the paint tray and ligature are hard to explain innocently. Gender considerations for beaver fur. Natural beaver fur is commonly used in men's coats because of its rugged look, but it's also used for casual wear by both men and women. Sheared beaver is used in high fashion garments for women. Therefore, the presence of beaver hair cannot by itself indicate whether the person wearing it was male or female. We believe that the person was male by the fact of the unidentified male DNA that was supposedly there and present at the location. So we assume that whoever was wearing this was a male who was, the one who was involved majorly. So we know if it's a rugged fur, and that's probably what we need to ask, what kind? If it's a rugged fur, if we still have access to that, what kind of fur does it look like, and where would you find this kind of fur? Man, I wish we would have been able to look back in Colorado at the time and say, where can we source this back to? Just like we did with the tape, we try to source it back to a store. Where can we source this fur back to? Because we sourced the shirt back to Israel. Where can we source this tape back to? Where can we source this rope back to in the area? Where can we source this beaver fur garment or these dark animal hairs back to? And it becomes important because, like we said before, there was an active interaction between John Bonet and this fur because it ended up on her hands. So somehow, some way, there was an interaction where the fur, and from what I read, it can stay on your hands. At least some of the fur can stay on your hands. Now, beaver fur is supposedly durable and you can't just rip it off, but it can shed a little bit, but it's not prone to shedding, which makes it a little bit more suspicious because it's not prone to shedding. So how did it just shed like crazy that night? Enough for it to be under, under the tape, and then you have a different kind of animal hair. And so we're not talking about now, and so we mentioned the person experiencing homelessness might have this beaver coat on because they bought it at the Salvation Army, but we're not also talking about a person who has another type of animal fur on as well that John Bonet grabbed on too, as we understand it. Could revise at a later point, but as we understand it now, John Bonet interacted with this sort of dark animal fur and was on her hands at the time of death. So apparently whatever person was interacting with her had on sort of these two different kinds of fur or fiber or nearby that they used. That's how we piece it together. And the cost of those furs and those fibers really matters because, again, we're talking about some pretty expensive clothing that is floating around this crime scene. But I'm going to stop there. Let me know what you think. Like, share, subscribe. Hope you're taking care of yourself. Hope you're doing well. Appreciate you watching. Appreciate you supporting. Again, I really want to hear your thoughts on this. What do you think? I've been throwing out a lot of theories. How are you puzzled by this? I'm puzzled. How are you puzzled by this? Let me know in the comments. Like, share, subscribe. Until the next time, take it easy.